The ice cube struck Jessica's collarbone first, followed by a freezing, violent wave of water that instantly soaked through her silk blouse, plastering it to her skin. The crystal goblet slammed back down onto the mahogany table with a sharp, echoing crack. The entire dining room, filled with 20 of New York's most influential socialites, went dead silent. She stood there, dripping, mascara stinging her eyes, as her future mother-in-law wiped a stray drop from her manicured hand, a look of utter disgust contorting her face. "Know your place, you pathetic gold digger," she hissed. Her fiancé sat frozen, staring at his plate. But before Jessica could even draw a breath to defend herself, the heavy oak doors of the dining room swung open. The room's temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees as a familiar, towering figure stepped into the light. Beatrice's face suddenly drained of all color. Jessica Jenkins had spent the last 3 years building a comfortable, quiet life in Brooklyn. She ran a small, boutique graphic design firm, paid her own bills, and prided herself on her fierce independence. She didn't care for flashy labels or high society name-dropping. That's probably why she didn't see the red flags when she first started dating Liam Brown. Liam was charming, handsome, and worked in private wealth management. When they met at a coffee shop in Soho, he was clumsy, spilling his macchiato on her laptop bag, and profusely apologetic. He seemed incredibly grounded. It wasn't until 6 months into their relationship that Jessica realized Brown wasn't just a surname. It was an institution. The Browns were old money, the kind of family whose ancestors had streets named after them in Manhattan, and who considered the Hamptons a mundane weekend getaway. Despite the glaring disparity in their bank accounts, Liam and Jessica fell deeply in love. He proposed on a rainy Tuesday in her cramped apartment, holding a vintage diamond ring, swearing that their differences didn't matter. But he was naive. He didn't understand that while he was marrying her, she was marrying into a dynasty, and the matriarch of that dynasty, Beatrice Brown, had decided the moment she met Jessica that she was a parasite. Beatrice was a terrifying woman. She was impeccably preserved, dressed exclusively in tailored Chanel, and wielded passive aggression like a scalpel. From the beginning, she made her disdain for Jessica clear. She would forget to invite her to family gatherings, intentionally mispronounce her last name as Jenkins, and constantly gift her etiquette books for the holidays. "She just needs time to warm up to you, Jessica," Liam would say, massaging her shoulders after another agonizing Sunday brunch, where Beatrice had pointedly asked if her little drawing hobby was making enough to pay for her subway fare. "She's protective. My older brother, Richard, had a messy divorce. She's just terrified of opportunists." "I have my own business, Liam," Jessica had argued, exhaustion seeping into her bones. "I don't want a dime of your family's money." "I know that," he kissed her forehead. "And soon, she will too, which is why this weekend is so important." This weekend was the annual Brown Summer Gala at their sprawling estate in East Hampton. But it wasn't just a gala. It was going to be their official engagement celebration. Liam had convinced Beatrice to host a private, intimate dinner for 20 of their closest friends and family members the night before the big party, specifically to welcome Jessica into the fold. She should have known it was a trap. Leading up to the trip, her anxiety was at an all-time high. She spent a week's worth of savings on a beautiful, understated navy blue evening gown, desperate to fit in, to prove she belonged. She didn't tell her older brother, Arthur, about the mounting dread. Arthur and Jessica had grown up in the foster system after their parents died in a car crash when she was 7 and he was 15. Arthur had practically raised her. He worked 3 jobs to put her through college and shielded her from the harshest realities of the world. Over the last decade, Arthur had moved out to the West Coast and built something of an empire in commercial real estate and tech acquisitions. He was fiercely private, operating through holding companies and trusts. He was a billionaire, though you would never know it by looking at him. He still wore faded Henley shirts and drove a 10-year-old truck. Jessica never talked about his wealth to Liam or anyone else. It wasn't her money to brag about, and Arthur valued his anonymity above all else. To the Browns, she was just a middle-class orphan from Ohio, and she preferred to keep it that way. "You look beautiful," Liam said, as they pulled up to the imposing wrought-iron gates of the Brown estate on Friday afternoon. The driveway was lined with centuries-old oak trees, leading up to a massive stone mansion that looked more like a fortress than a home. Jessica took a deep, shaky breath, smoothing down her skirt. "Promise me you won't leave my side tonight?" "I promise," Liam smiled warmly, squeezing her hand. "It's going to be perfect. My mother promised to be on her best behavior." That was Liam's fatal flaw. He believed in the goodness of people, especially his mother, to the point of absolute delusion. He had no idea that Beatrice had spent the last month orchestrating an evening designed exclusively to break her. The moment they stepped into the grand foyer, the air felt suffocating. The house smelled of expensive lilies, lemon oil, and old money. Beatrice descended the sweeping marble staircase, like royalty surveying her subjects. She wore a pearl-colored silk dress, her blonde hair perfectly coiffed, a tight, artificial smile plastered on her face. "Liam, darling," she cooed, accepting his kiss on her cheek. Then, her icy blue eyes shifted to Jessica. Her smile didn't reach her eyes. It rarely did. "Jessica, you made it. And in such an interesting little dress. Is that polyester?" "It's silk, Mrs. Brown," Jessica said, keeping her voice even, forcing a polite smile. "Thank you for hosting us." "Of course," she said dismissively, already turning away. "Liam, your father needs you in the study immediately. Something about the quarterly projections for the London office. Go on." "Oh, but I promised Jessica I'd show her to our room," Liam started. "Nonsense. The staff will take her bags," Beatrice interrupted smoothly. "Business first, Liam. Jessica can entertain herself for 20 minutes. She's a big girl." Liam gave her an apologetic look. "I'll be right back, I swear." And just like that, he was gone, absorbed into the mahogany depths of the estate, leaving her completely alone with the wolf. The intimate dinner was a farce. Beatrice had invited the most vicious, judgmental gossips of her social circle. As the evening progressed to the cocktail hour on the back terrace, overlooking the manicured croquet lawns and the ocean, Jessica found herself systematically isolated. Every time she tried to join a conversation, Beatrice was there, expertly steering the topic toward things she knew she couldn't relate to. Summers in Saint-Tropez, the logistics of purchasing a second yacht, the specific breeding lines of purebred Arabian horses. Jessica, dear, a woman named Sylvia, dripping in emeralds, addressed her, her voice dripping with condescension. Beatrice had just introduced her to Jessica. "Beatrice tells me you work with computers? Are you a typist?" A few of the women chuckled behind their champagne flutes. "I run a graphic design and branding agency," Jessica corrected politely, taking a sip of sparkling water. "We handle corporate identities, marketing campaigns." "How quaint," Sylvia remarked, exchanging a knowing glance with Beatrice. "It's so important for young women to have little projects to keep them busy before they have children. And your family?" Beatrice mentioned you don't have anyone. No parents to speak of? The casual cruelty of the question felt like a physical blow. Jessica tightened her grip on her glass. "My parents passed away when I was young. My older brother raised me." "Oh, a tragedy," Beatrice sighed, pressing a hand to her chest in a mockery of sympathy. "And what does this brother do? Construction? Plumber? I imagine it must have been so difficult for him to provide, scraping by on minimum wage. We should see if the estate manager has any manual labor jobs open for him. Don't you think, Sylvia?" Jessica's blood began to boil. It was one thing for Beatrice to attack her, but insulting Arthur, the man who sacrificed his own youth to give her a future, was crossing a line she didn't know she had. "Arthur doesn't need a job," Jessica said, her voice dropping an octave, losing its polite, submissive lilt. "He does quite well for himself." Beatrice let out a sharp, melodic laugh. "Of course he does, dear. We all have our own definitions of doing well. Some consider paying rent on time an achievement." She took a delicate sip of her martini. "I just hope you aren't expecting Liam to subsidize your extended family. The Brown wealth is meant to build a legacy. not function as a charity for the less fortunate. Jessica stared at her, the mask of the polite future daughter-in-law slipping. Liam and I have never discussed my family needing his money, Beatrice. Because they don't. Beatrice's eyes narrowed. The playful hostility vanished, replaced by a cold, hard glare. Watch your tone with me, little girl. You might have blinded my son with whatever cheap tricks you use, but I see exactly what you are. You are a social climber, desperate for a handout. You are not one of us, and you never will be. Before Jessica could respond, a chime echoed through the terrace. Dinner was served. Liam finally emerged from the house, looking exhausted, completely oblivious to the war that had just been declared. He wrapped an arm around her waist, kissing her temple. Sorry that took so long. Ready for dinner? She looked at him, then at Beatrice, who was already walking toward the dining room, her posture victorious. She should have told Liam they were leaving right then. She should have walked out, but stubbornness rooted her to the spot. She wasn't going to let Beatrice chase her away. Yes, Jessica said quietly, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. Let's eat. The dining room was a masterclass in intimidation. An enormous crystal chandelier hung over a long mahogany table set for 20. Heavy silver cutlery gleamed under the warm light. Jessica was seated uncomfortably far from Liam. Beatrice had arranged the place cards, so Liam was flanked by two daughters of prominent hedge fund managers, while she was sandwiched between an elderly, hard-of-hearing uncle and Sylvia. From the moment the first course, a delicate lobster bisque, was served, the barrage began. It started subtly. Beatrice loudly praised the pedigree of the women sitting next to Liam, lamenting how rare it is to find girls of proper breeding these days. Liam, to his credit, looked uncomfortable, but he didn't stop her. He just offered her tight, reassuring smiles from across the long table. As the main course of roasted duck arrived, the wine began to flow heavily, and Beatrice's tongue loosened further. The conversation shifted to investments and business acquisitions. Liam's father, a quiet, stern man named Charles, finally spoke up, mentioning a massive real estate development in downtown Manhattan that the Brown firm was trying to secure funding for. We need a heavy hitter to partner with, Charles grumbled, slicing his duck. The primary backer backed out. If we don't secure a co-investor by Monday, the city is giving the contract to a rival firm. It's a multi-billion-dollar project. We've reached out to Zenith Holdings, but getting a meeting with their CEO is like trying to get an audience with the Pope. Zenith Holdings. Jessica froze, her fork hovering halfway to her mouth. Zenith Holdings was Arthur's primary umbrella corporation. Well, you'll secure it, Charles, Beatrice said dismissively. The Brown name commands respect. She then turned her gaze directly down the table to Jessica. The entire room seemed to quiet down, sensing the shift in her attention. Speaking of securing futures, Jessica, Liam tells me you've refused to sign the prenuptial agreement. The room went dead silent. The clinking of silverware stopped. All eyes turned to Jessica, her face flushed hot. This was a private conversation she and Liam had had 2 days ago. She hadn't refused. She had simply asked to have her own lawyer review the 70-page document before signing it. Mother, Liam finally interjected, his voice tight. This isn't the time or the place. Oh, nonsense, Liam. We are all family here, or close enough, Beatrice snapped, her eyes never leaving Jessica's. I think it's perfectly acceptable to discuss the protection of our family's assets, especially when dealing with someone who brings absolutely nothing to the table. Tell me, Jessica, what exactly do you contribute to this union? Besides a struggling little art project and a brother who likely lives in a trailer? Mother, stop it. Liam stood up, his chair scraping loudly against the hardwood floor. Sit down, Liam, Beatrice barked, standing up herself. She grabbed her heavy crystal water goblet, the ice clinking menacingly inside. She leaned forward, glaring at Jessica with unhinged fury. I will not let this grifter manipulate you. Look at her. Look at her cheap dress and her pathetic silence. She is nothing. Her family is nothing. A couple of street rats trying to leech off. Do not speak about my family, Jessica said. Her voice was quiet, but it cut through the room like a whip. She stood up slowly, pushing her chair back. Her hands were trembling, but she forced herself to meet Beatrice's furious gaze. "You can insult me all you want, Beatrice, but you will not speak about my brother. You have no idea who he is or what he has built. I don't care what that trash has built." Beatrice shrieked, her veneer of high society elegance completely shattering. "You are not worthy of my son." In a flash of blinding rage, Beatrice swung her arm. The ice cube struck Jessica's collarbone first. The freezing, violent wave of water instantly soaked through her silk blouse, plastering it to her skin, running down her face and dripping off her eyelashes. The crystal goblet slammed back down onto the mahogany table with a sharp, echoing crack. Someone gasped. The entire dining room, filled with 20 of New York's most influential socialites, went dead silent. Jessica stood there, dripping, the cold shock stealing the breath from her lungs. Humiliation burned in her throat like acid. She looked at Liam. He was staring at her, his mouth open in horror, but his feet remained glued to the floor. He didn't rush to her. He didn't grab a napkin. He just stood there, paralyzed by his mother's rage. Beatrice wiped a stray drop of water from her manicured hand, a look of utter disgust contorting her face. "Know your place, you pathetic gold digger," she hissed into the silence. Jessica blinked away the stinging water in her eyes, preparing to turn and walk out of that house, out of Liam's life, forever. But before she could take a single step, the heavy oak double doors of the dining room didn't just open. They were shoved apart with such force they banged against the walls. The room's temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees. Footsteps, heavy and deliberate, echoed into the dead, silent room. A man stepped into the soft glow of the chandeliers. He was in his mid-30s, wearing a sharply tailored, midnight blue Tom Ford suit that screamed power. He was over 6 feet tall, with broad shoulders, piercing dark eyes, and a jawline set in stone. He exuded an aura of total, terrifying authority. 2 men in dark suits, security stood silently in the hallway behind him. Beatrice's face suddenly drained of all color. Beside her, Charles Brown dropped his knife. It clattered against his plate loudly. "Mr. Jenkins," Charles stuttered, his voice trembling, his arrogant posture dissolving instantly. "We didn't expect you. The security didn't say." Arthur didn't even look at Charles. His cold, dark eyes swept the room, taking in the frozen guests, taking in Liam standing uselessly by his chair, and finally, landing on Jessica. He saw her soaking wet dress. He saw the ice cubes melting on the table in front of Beatrice. He saw the tears of humiliation she was desperately trying to hold back. A muscle ticked in Arthur's jaw. The silence in the room became suffocating, pregnant with a violent kind of tension. He slowly turned his gaze to Beatrice, who was now trembling, her hand still resting near the empty water goblet. "I received an invitation to an engagement dinner," Arthur said, his voice dangerously low, a calm, lethal rumble that echoed off the mahogany walls. "But it appears I've walked into a mistake." He took a slow step into the room, his eyes locking onto Beatrice with the intensity of a predator. "Is there a problem here, Mrs. Brown?" Arthur asked softly. "Or did you just accidentally spill water on my little sister?" The silence in the dining room was so absolute you could hear the soft hum of the central air conditioning. Jessica's brother, Arthur, stood at the head of the room, his dark eyes fixed on Beatrice with a terrifying, unblinking stillness. Charles Brown was the first to break the paralysis. He practically fell out of his chair, his face a sickly shade of gray, the arrogant posture of a Wall Street titan entirely evaporated. "Mr. Jenkins," Charles stammered, his hands fluttering nervously over his plate. "Arthur, we had no idea. The board at Zenith Holdings said you were unavailable until next quarter. If we had known you were coming to the Hamptons—" "I wasn't coming for a board meeting, Charles," Arthur interrupted, his voice perfectly level, which only made it more menacing. He didn't even look at the older man. His gaze remained locked on Beatrice, who was clutching her pearl necklace so tightly her knuckles were white. "I was coming to celebrate the engagement of my little sister, the same sister your wife just assaulted." The word hung in the air like a guillotine blade. Assaulted. Sylvia, the woman who had been mocking her moments before, pressed a napkin to her mouth, her eyes darting between Jessica and the towering billionaire at the door. The piece Beatrice finally found her voice, though it was a reedy, trembling imitation of her usual aristocratic drawl. There has been a misunderstanding, a terrible misunderstanding. Jessica didn't tell us. She never said. She didn't tell you she was backed by a $50 billion trust because she wanted to be loved for who she is, Arthur said, taking another slow step forward. The two security guards in the hall remained perfectly still, a silent testament to the power Arthur wielded, a concept that is clearly entirely foreign to the Brown family. Arthur finally broke eye contact with Beatrice and looked at Liam. Liam was pale, his eyes wide with a mixture of shock and dawning horror. He looked from Jessica, soaking wet and shivering, to her brother. "Jessica, why didn't you tell me?" he whispered, his voice cracking. The betrayal Jessica felt in that moment superseded the cold of the ice water soaking into her skin. "Because it shouldn't have mattered, Liam," she said, her voice shaking, though not from the cold. "And clearly, it didn't. You let her do this." I didn't know she was going," to Liam stuttered, taking a step toward her, reaching out a hand. "Do not touch her," Arthur commanded. The words were quiet, but they cracked like a whip across the room. Liam froze, instantly retreating. Arthur walked the length of the long mahogany table. The wealthy elite of New York practically shrank into their high-backed chairs as he passed. He stopped beside her and, without a word, shrugged off his midnight blue Tom Ford suit jacket. He draped it gently over her freezing shoulders. It smelled like cedar and expensive cologne, the scent of home, of safety. She pulled the heavy wool tightly around herself, a single tear finally escaping and tracking through her ruined makeup. "We are leaving," Arthur said softly to Jessica, wrapping a protective arm around her waist. "Wait! Arthur, please!" Charles practically shouted, rounding the table in a desperate panic. "The Hudson Yards expansion project. We are scheduled to finalize the proposal with your acquisitions team on Monday. If Zenith pulls out, the Brown firm will face insolvency. We are heavily leveraged. You know this." Arthur paused. He slowly turned his head to look at Charles. The desperation rolling off Liam's father was pathetic. The great Brown empire was built on a foundation of sand, and Zenith Holdings was the only thing keeping the tide at bay. "I am aware of your leverage, Charles," Arthur said, his tone clinical, stripped of all emotion. "I am also aware that your firm has been masking its liquidity issues for the last 3 quarters. I was willing to overlook it and underwrite the expansion because I believed my sister had found a family that would care for her." Arthur's gaze shifted back to Beatrice, who looked like she might faint. "But looking at my sister right now, shivering in a dress your wife ruined, surrounded by people who mocked her for being an orphan, I think Zenith Holdings will be looking elsewhere for a partner." "No, no, you can't do that!" Beatrice suddenly shrieked, the reality of the situation shattering her pride. She lunged forward, nearly knocking over her crystal goblet. "It was a joke, a lapse in judgment. I was just testing her resolve. We love Jessica. Liam loves her. You don't know the meaning of the word," Arthur said in disgust. He looked at Liam one last time. "You had one job, protect her. You failed." With that, Arthur guided her toward the grand double doors. No one tried to stop them. No one spoke. The only sound was the clicking of Jessica's heels on the hardwood floor and the ragged breaths of Charles Brown as he watched his family's legacy evaporate into thin air. As they stepped out into the humid Hamptons night air, the heavy oak doors of the Brown estate shut behind them with a resounding, final thud. The ride away from the estate was a blur. Arthur's driver held the door of the sleek black Maybach open for them, and Jessica collapsed into the plush leather seats, pulling her knees to her chest. For the first 10 minutes, Arthur didn't say a word. He just opened a compartment, handed her a dry, heated towel, and poured her a glass of sparkling water from the minibar. He let her cry. He let the adrenaline crash. "I'm sorry," she finally choked out, burying her face in the towel. "I'm so sorry, Arthur. You warned me. You told me old money families were vipers, and she didn't listen. You have nothing to apologize for, Chloe, Arthur said gently, his large hand resting on her shoulder. The cold, ruthless billionaire, who had just dismantled a dynasty in under 3 minutes, was gone, replaced by the big brother who used to make her boxed macaroni and cheese when they lived in a studio apartment in Queens. You gave him a chance. He showed you who he really is. He just stood there, she whispered, the image of Liam frozen by his chair, burning behind her eyelids. He didn't even hand me a napkin. He let her humiliate me. Cowardice is a quiet kind of cruelty, Arthur replied, his voice hardening slightly. A man who cannot stand up to his mother will never stand up for his wife. You dodged a bullet, a very expensive, pathetic bullet. They didn't go back to Brooklyn. Arthur had his driver take them to the Topping Rose House, an ultra-luxury boutique hotel in Bridgehampton where he had rented the private owner's cottage. By the time they arrived, her phone was a vibrating nightmare. 17 missed calls from Liam, 4 from Charles, even a text from Beatrice, which Jessica deleted without reading. Jessica changed into an oversized cashmere sweater and sweatpants that Arthur's assistant had somehow procured, and sat on the edge of the massive king-sized bed. Her phone buzzed again. Liam. She stared at the screen. A part of her, the part that had spent the last 3 years building a life with this man, wanted to answer. She wanted to scream at him, to demand an explanation, to hear him beg for forgiveness. If you answer it, you give him power, Arthur said, leaning against the doorframe of the bedroom, holding 2 mugs of tea. He walked over and handed her one. I just want to know why, she said, her voice hollow. I can tell you why, Arthur sighed, sitting in the armchair opposite the bed. The Brown firm is drowning. They've made a series of catastrophic investments over the last 5 years in commercial real estate that tanked post-pandemic. They've been bleeding capital. The Hudson Yards deal was their Hail Mary. Jessica frowned, confused. But if they are broke, why was Beatrice so obsessed with her being a gold digger? Projection, Arthur sneered softly, and arrogance. They are desperate to maintain the illusion of immense wealth, which means they needed Liam to marry someone from their own circle who could inject capital into the family without asking too many questions. A quiet, middle-class girl with a graphic design business wasn't going to save their empire. To Beatrice, you were a liability taking up space where a wealthy heiress should be. So, they didn't know about you? I keep my private life entirely separate from Zenith. My legal last name isn't even tied to the primary holding company documents for that exact reason. Charles only knew me as A.J. until my team started negotiations last month. They had no idea Jessica Jenkins was my sister. Arthur took a sip of his tea. If they had known, Beatrice would have been feeding you grapes on a chaise lounge. The sheer hypocrisy of it made Jessica physically nauseous. They didn't hate her for who she was. They hated her for what they thought her bank account lacked. And Liam. Did Liam know how bad his family's finances were? Did he keep her in the dark too? Her phone buzzed again. A text from Liam. Jessica, please. I am so sorry. I was in shock. I love you. My mother is out of her mind. Please just call me. We need to fix this. My dad is having a panic attack. Zenith is pulling the term sheets. Please, baby, talk to Arthur. She read the text twice. The nausea faded, replaced by a profound, icy clarity. He didn't ask if she was okay. He didn't ask if she was warm, or if she needed him to come to her. He apologized, yes. But nestled right there, in his panic, was the true priority. Zenith is pulling the term sheets. Talk to Arthur. He wanted her to be his broker. He wanted her to fix the mess his mother created so his family wouldn't lose their fortune. She handed the phone to Arthur. He read the text, his expression remaining impassive, but his jaw tightened. What do you want to do, Jessica? Arthur asked quietly. It's your life. It's your relationship. If you want me to fund his father's company so you can have your wedding, I will. I'll buy the whole damn firm and put it in your name if it makes you happy. Jessica looked at the diamond engagement ring on her left hand. In the soft light of the hotel room, it suddenly looked cheap. It felt heavy, like a shackle. "No," she said, her voice steady for the first time that night. "I don't want his ring, and I don't want his family." She took the ring off, the metal sliding easily over her knuckle. She placed it on the nightstand. "I want to go home, Arthur. Back to Brooklyn." Arthur nodded, a faint smile touching the corners of his mouth. "Okay, we'll head out first thing in the morning." But the Browns weren't going to let a multi-billion-dollar lifeline slip away quietly in the night. At 7 a.m. the next morning, as Jessica was packing her small overnight bag, a heavy knock echoed through the cottage. Arthur's security detail murmured something outside the door. She walked out to the living room to find Arthur standing by the front window, looking out at the gravel driveway. "It seems," Arthur said, his voice laced with dangerous amusement, "that Liam and his parents have decided to pay us a visit, and Beatrice is carrying a bakery box. I think they brought apology croissants." Jessica walked up to the window and peered through the sheer curtains. There they were, the great Brown family, standing on the pristine gravel of the topping Rose House driveway, looking entirely out of their element. Charles was pacing, his phone pressed to his ear, his face flushed and sweating despite the cool morning breeze. Liam stood rigidly by the door, looking pale and sleep-deprived. And Beatrice. Beatrice was a sight Jessica would never forget. The immaculate, terrifying matriarch from last night was gone. She was wearing a trench coat, hastily tied over what looked like loungewear, her hair pulled back into a severe, messy knot. In her hands, as Arthur had noted, was a pink pastry box from a local artisanal bakery. The irony was suffocating. 12 hours ago, she wasn't fit to eat at her table. Now, she was delivering her breakfast. "Let them in," she said, her voice eerily calm. The anxiety that usually spiked in her chest whenever Beatrice was near had completely vanished. It had been replaced by a cold, hard shell. Arthur raised an eyebrow, a smirk playing on his lips. He nodded at the security guard stationed by the door. The guard opened it, stepping aside. The Browns practically tumbled into the foyer. The moment Beatrice saw Jessica, her face contorted into a mask of exaggerated, frantic relief. "Jessica? Oh, my sweet girl," Beatrice cried out, rushing forward. She shoved the pastry box onto a side table and reached out to grab her hands. Jessica took a deliberate step back, crossing her arms over her chest. Her hands grabbed empty air. The fake smile on her face faltered for a fraction of a second before she forced it back into place. "We were so worried," Beatrice stammered, her eyes darting nervously to Arthur, who remained leaning against the wall, sipping his tea with the casual detachment of a man watching a predictable movie. "Last night it was a disaster. I had too much to drink, darling. The stress of the gala, the mixing of medications. I wasn't in my right mind. I would never, ever, intentionally hurt you. You're going to be my daughter." "You threw a glass of ice water at my head and called me a gold digger in front of 20 people, she stated flatly. She didn't yell, she didn't cry, she just stated the facts. "It was a terrible, tasteless joke," Beatrice pleaded, her voice pitching higher. "I was trying to show those awful, judgmental women that you were strong, that you could handle the pressure of our world. It was a test, Jessica, and you passed. You stood up for yourself beautifully." The delusion was staggering. Jessica looked at Liam. He was staring at the floor, refusing to meet her eyes. "Liam," Jessica said. He flinched, finally looking up. "Is that what you think happened? A test?" Liam swallowed hard, stepping forward. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box, the ring she had left on the nightstand. He must have somehow intercepted it from the hotel staff, or perhaps she had left it on the entryway console in her rush. Actually, no, it was still on the nightstand. He had a different box. "Jessica, please," Liam begged, his voice cracking. "My mother is deeply, profoundly sorry. We both are. I was paralyzed last night. I've never seen her act like that, and I froze. It was the biggest mistake of my life. I love you. We are meant to be together. Please, put the ring back on. Let's go back to the city. We can go to couples counseling. We can fix this. You want to fix our relationship? She asked, tilting her head. Or do you want to fix your father's balance sheet? Charles, who had been hovering near the door, finally broke. Arthur, Mr. Jenkins, please, he pleaded, bypassing Jessica entirely to address her brother. I understand your anger. I do. My wife's behavior was inexcusable. But you cannot punish thousands of employees and decades of legacy for the actions of one woman. If Zenith pulls out of the Hudson Yards deal today, the banks will call in our loans by Wednesday. We will be bankrupt. Everything we have, it will be gone. Arthur slowly lowered his teacup. He pushed himself off the wall and walked toward Charles. The sheer difference in their presence was undeniable. Charles was a man pretending to have power. Arthur was the man who actually held it. Charles, Arthur said softly, his voice echoing in the quiet cottage. You seem to be operating under a misconception. You think I pulled the term sheets because your wife insulted my sister. Charles blinked, confused. Well, yes, you said. I said I would no longer be underwriting your expansion, Arthur corrected smoothly, because doing so would be a terrible investment. Your firm isn't just bleeding capital, Charles. You are actively committing fraud. My acquisitions team spent the night going through the shadow ledgers you tried to hide during the initial due diligence. Charles went paper white. Beatrice gasped, covering her mouth. You've been inflating your assets to secure further loans from overseas, Arthur continued, his tone clinical and ruthless. If I had signed that deal on Monday, Zenith would have been liable for your toxic debt. My sister's heartbreak was merely the catalyst that made me look closer at the fine print. That's a lie, Charles choked out, though his trembling hands told a different story. It's not, Arthur said, and because I don't appreciate people who try to swindle my company or people who abuse my family, I made a few phone calls at 3 a.m. I didn't just pull the term sheets, Charles. Zenith Holdings bought up the majority of your mezzanine debt from your secondary lenders. The silence in the room was absolute. Even Jessica stared at her brother in shock. I am your primary creditor now, Arthur whispered, stepping into Charles's personal space. And I am calling the loans in, all of them, effective immediately. Beatrice let out a sound that Jessica could only describe as the dying gasp of a wounded animal. It was a guttural, terrifying wail that scraped against the pristine walls of the topping Rose House foyer. Her knees completely buckled, and she collapsed onto the plush, hand-woven entryway rug. The trench coat she had hastily thrown on spilled open, and the pink artisanal bakery box tumbled from her manicured hands. A half-dozen perfectly flaky butter croissants scattered across the hardwood floor, coming to rest against the polished leather boots of Arthur's security detail. No! Beatrice shrieked, her voice cracking as she looked up at Arthur with a cocktail of pure, unadulterated hatred and blinding panic. You cannot do this. You are ruining us. You are destroying my family over a spilled glass of water. I am not destroying your family over water, Beatrice, Arthur replied, his voice a calm, chilling deadpan. I am destroying your family's empire because it is built on a foundation of lies, and you were foolish enough to hand me the sledgehammer. You committed fraud. You cross-collateralized assets that didn't exist to secure foreign investments. My team spent the last 12 hours unraveling a web of shadow ledgers that would make a cartel accountant blush. You ruined yourselves. I am merely the executioner. Charles Brown, a man who had spent the last 3 decades cultivating an aura of untouchable Wall Street superiority, completely unraveled. He lunged forward, bypassing his weeping wife on the floor, and reached desperately for Arthur's arm. Before his fingers could even brush the fabric of Arthur's shirt, the 2 men in dark suits stepped forward, forming an impenetrable wall of muscle between the billionaire and the bankrupt patriarch. Mr. Jenkins, Arthur, please, I am begging you, Charles sobbed, the sweat beading on his forehead visibly trembling. We have hundreds of employees. We have a legacy. If you call in those loans today, the SEC will be involved by Tuesday. We will face criminal charges. I could go to prison. I'll give you equity. I'll step down as CEO. Just, please, don't pull the plug. Arthur looked at Charles with the kind of detached pity one might reserve for a dying insect. You should have thought about your legacy before you cooked your books, Charles, and you certainly should have thought about it before you allowed your wife to treat my sister like something she scraped off the bottom of her shoe. The demand letters have already been filed with your secondary lenders. You have 48 hours to produce $3 billion in liquid capital. Good luck. Arthur turned away, dismissing the man entirely. The utter finality in his posture sucked the remaining oxygen out of the room. Jessica turned her attention to Liam. He was standing near the doorframe, his face the color of wet ash. He looked utterly broken, staring at his parents in horror. The illusion of his perfect, untouchable family had shattered into a million irreparable pieces in less than 10 minutes. The wealth, the prestige, the arrogance, it was all a beautifully painted stage set, and Arthur had just kicked over the primary support beam. "Liam," she said. Her voice was incredibly soft, almost a whisper, yet it cut through his mother's frantic sobbing. He looked at her, his eyes bloodshot and brimming with tears. He took a hesitant half-step forward, his hands trembling as he reached out toward her. "Jessica, please, you know me. You know I didn't want any of this." "I don't know you at all," she replied, feeling a strange, profound sense of peace settling over her chest. The crushing anxiety that had plagued her for the last 6 months of their relationship was entirely gone. The man I thought I loved would have caught that glass before it hit her. The man I thought I loved would have grabbed her hand and walked out of that dining room without a second thought. "I was in shock," he pleaded, his voice cracking. "I froze. People freeze, Jessica. It was a mistake." "You didn't freeze, Liam," she corrected gently, shaking her head. "You made a choice. In that split second, you weighed the discomfort of standing up to your mother against my humiliation, and you chose to let me drown. And now, you're standing here, holding an engagement ring, not because you can't live without me, but because you can't live without my brother's money." "That's not true," he cried, a tear finally spilling over his cheek. "It is," she said. She pointed to the hallway leading to the master suite. "The ring is on the nightstand. Keep it. Sell it to pay for your father's defense attorney. Do whatever you need to do. But do not ever contact me again. If you text me, I will block you. If you show up at my apartment, I will have you arrested for harassment. We are completely, unequivocally done." She didn't wait for his response. She turned her back on the man she had almost married and walked over to her brother. "I'm ready to go home, Arthur." Arthur nodded, a fierce, protective pride shining in his dark eyes. He looked at his security detail. "Escort the Browns off the property. If they resist, call the local authorities for trespassing." They didn't wait to watch them be forcibly removed. Arthur placed a heavy, warm hand on the center of her back and guided her out the rear exit of the cottage, toward the gravel driveway where the sleek black Maybach was idling. As they pulled away from the Topping Rose house, Jessica rolled down the tinted window just a fraction. The cool morning air rushed in, carrying the scent of salt water and pine. She looked back one last time. She could see Liam standing on the pristine driveway, his shoulders slumped, his head buried in his hands. Beside him, Charles was furiously dialing his phone, while Beatrice remained on her knees in the dirt, staring blankly at the scattered croissants. She rolled the window up, sealing out the noise, the drama, and the toxicity forever. The collapse of the Brown Empire was swift, brutal, and incredibly public. It was the talk of Manhattan, dominating the financial news networks and the society pages alike. Monday morning, at 9 a.m., Zenith Holdings officially acquired the mezzanine debt and issued the demand letters. By Tuesday afternoon, unable to produce the required billions, the Brown firm defaulted. The ensuing panic on Wall Street was immediate. The firm was forced to declare Chapter 11 bankruptcy by Thursday. But Arthur's warnings about the shadow ledgers hadn't been an empty threat. The sudden bankruptcy triggered an automatic audit, and federal regulators descended on the Brown headquarters like a swarm of locusts. They uncovered nearly a decade of rampant financial mismanagement, inflated assets, and wire fraud. The fallout was spectacular. The family's assets were seized and liquidated to pay off their massive list of creditors. The sprawling East Hampton estate, the very place where Beatrice had thrown ice water in Jessica's face, was auctioned off to a tech billionaire from Silicon Valley who immediately bulldozed the historic mansion to build a modern, glass-paneled smart home. Their penthouse on the Upper East Side was sold, and their memberships to every elite country club and dining society in the city were quietly but firmly revoked. The social exile was perhaps the hardest blow for Beatrice. In the world of old money, poverty, and scandal were treated like contagious diseases. Sylvia, the woman dripping in emeralds who had mocked her career, was the first to cut ties, publicly claiming she barely knew the Browns. 3 months after the engagement dinner, a tabloid published a photo of Beatrice being politely but firmly escorted out of the dining room at the Plaza Hotel because her credit card had declined. She was wearing last season's Chanel, looking gaunt and furious. Liam didn't fare much better. He tried to leverage his Ivy League degree and his years of experience at his father's firm to find a new position, but his last name had become radioactive in the financial sector. No reputable bank or wealth management firm would touch anyone associated with the Brown fraud scandal. Last heard through the grapevine, he had relocated to Chicago, working a mid-level accounting job under an assumed name, living in a studio apartment that was a fraction of the size of the walk-in closet he grew up with. As for Jessica, the end of her relationship marked the beginning of her true life. Returning to Brooklyn felt like drawing her first full breath of air in 3 years. Without the constant looming anxiety of Beatrice's expectations and Liam's passive-aggressive need for her to conform, her creativity exploded. She poured all her leftover adrenaline and heartbreak into her boutique graphic design agency, Aura. 6 months after the disastrous dinner, her agency pitched a massive, multi-million-dollar rebranding campaign for a major European luxury fashion house, ironically, a brand that had once famously refused to dress Beatrice Brown for the Met Gala. They won the contract. The influx of capital allowed her to expand her team. She moved her offices from a cramped co-working space into a stunning, sun-drenched loft in Dumbo, overlooking the Brooklyn Bridge and the Manhattan skyline. She bought her own vintage diamond ring, a beautiful Art Deco piece, and wore it on her right hand as a promise to never compromise her own worth for someone else's approval again. Her relationship with Arthur shifted too. The incident had forced him to drop the extreme secrecy he had maintained to protect her. He realized that hiding his wealth hadn't shielded her from predators. It had only made her a target for bullies who thought she had no defense. He started stepping into the public eye more frequently, and he made sure she was right there next to him. They began attending highly publicized charity galas and foundation dinners together. When the paparazzi snapped photos of them, the captions didn't read Arthur Jenkins and a mystery guest. They read billionaire tech titan Arthur Jenkins with his sister, CEO, and founder of Aura Design Group, Jessica Jenkins. Jessica was no longer a secret to be kept, nor a charity case to be pitied. They were equals, standing side by side. One crisp Friday evening, about a year after the breakup, Jessica was sitting in her favorite local coffee shop in Williamsburg, sketching ideas on her tablet. The bell above the door chimed, and a familiar scent of overly heavy floral perfume wafted into the small space. She looked up, standing by the pastry counter, looking older, tired, and deeply out of place in the hipster-filled cafe, was Beatrice Brown. Beatrice saw her, her eyes widening in recognition. For a moment, they just stared at each other across the room. Jessica waited for the familiar spike of fear, the urge to shrink herself to make the older woman comfortable. But it never came. She just felt a profound, echoing emptiness. Beatrice took a step toward her table, her mouth opening, perhaps to apologize, perhaps to beg for a connection to her brother's wealth. But before she could speak, Jessica simply picked up her coffee cup, offered her a small, polite, and completely icy smile, and turned her eyes back to her screen. She stopped in her tracks. She understood the message. She wasn't angry anymore, but she was unreachable. She turned around and walked out into the chilly Brooklyn evening, disappearing into the crowd. Jessica took a sip of her dark roast coffee. She had learned the hard way that true wealth isn't measured by the legacy of your last name, the square footage of your estate, or the cruelty you can inflict on those you deem beneath you. It is measured by the resilience of your spirit, the integrity of your work, and the people who will tear down the walls of a mansion just to hand you a dry towel. She was Jessica Jenkins, and her life was just getting started. Wow, what a wild ride. If Jessica's story taught us anything, it's that true colors always shine through, eventually, and karma never misses a beat, especially when you mess with the wrong family. Beatrice thought she held all the cards, but she had no idea she was playing against the owner of the casino. Have you ever dealt with a toxic mother-in-law or a partner who refused to stand up for you? Drop your stories in the comments below. We love reading them and supporting this amazing community. If you love this story of ultimate revenge, boundaries, and standing your ground, make sure to hit that like button. It really helps the channel grow. Don't forget to share this video with someone who needs a reminder of their own worth, and subscribe with notifications turned on so you never miss another dramatic, real-life story just like this one.